The War of the Worlds. The War of the Worlds. 5. The Heat Ray.
Okay, so welcome back for Chapter 5 then. Here we have the Heat Ray chapter. The title itself speaks volumes, doesn't it? It's foreshadowing what's going to happen in this chapter. It sounds like a weapon. It is a weapon. And the all false sense of security is gone now, and we're now into titling the chapters as the threat emerges. And here the threat is of this heat ray. Now this is something which sounds quite old-fashioned to us now. We think of, like, or maybe you don't think of, but I think of sort of old 1950s sci-fi films and cartoons, and a bit like this 1953 film that we've looked at for War of the Worlds that has these heat rays and space rays and these other sort of rays. Well, that all came from H.G. Wells with this in 1890s, writing about a heat ray for its time, very, very futuristic, very prophetic, looking forward to the future and predicting the future. Obviously, we don't have heat rays even now, but we do have lasers, which is sort of, it kind of foreshadowed what was going to happen there. So we've got this heat ray, which is a devastating weapon. So let's find out a bit more about that.
After the glimpse I had had of the Martians, emerging from the cylinder in which they had come to the Earth from their planet, a kind of fascination paralyzed my actions. I remained standing knee-deep in the heather, staring at the mound that hid them. I was a battleground of fear and curiosity.
So we've got a metaphor at the end of that paragraph. I was a battleground of fear and curiosity. And of course that metaphor there, it uses the vehicle of the metaphor. So in a metaphor you have a vehicle and a tenor. Tenor is the thing being described. In this case it's him, so he's the tenor, T-E-N-O-R, like a musical tenor, rather than a £10 note. And the battleground is the vehicle. So this is the thing he's being compared to. He's like a battleground. He's a battleground of fear. So that borrows from the semantic field, which means the sort of group of words or feeling of action and battle and conflict. So you'll find in this chapter and throughout the book really, there's a semantic field, S-E-M-A-N-T-I-C. We've met that word before. I'm sure we have semantic field, just meaning words in the category of or in the style of. And these words tend to be to do with battle, which is no coincidence, of course. The whole book is called War of the Worlds, so we'd expect to find lots of conflict and battle. And of course we do. But even he himself is a battleground of fear and curiosity. And what do we call it when two words are put together to create that effect? Hendiadys, that's right. H-E-N-D-I... Oh, I can't do it like that. H-E-N-D-I-A-D-Y-S. Hendiadys. Both words effectively mean the same thing, although you can tell that there's a slight difference because one is fear and one is curiosity. He wants to get closer, but he knows he must stay away from them. So there's that conflict inside himself. So even inside himself there's conflict, as well as the larger conflict on Horsell Common. So what you could even say, if this extract came up in the exam, which it might well do, it's one of the most important chapters actually, you might want to say that his internal conflict is what's called a microcosm, M-I-C-R-O-C-O-S-M, microcosm, of the greater conflict in the book. That's when something very small represents something much larger. So his own conflict could be seen to represent the larger conflict of the whole book. So it's a microcosm. Let's move on.
I did not dare go back towards the pit, but I felt a passionate longing to peer into it. I began walking, therefore, in a big curve, seeking some point of vantage and continually looking at the sand heaps that hid these newcomers to our earth. Once a leash of thin black whips, like the arms of an octopus, flashed across the sunset and was immediately withdrawn, and afterwards a thin rod rose up, joint by joint, bearing at its apex a circular disc that spun with a wobbling motion. What could be going on there?
So we're back to this description of their tentacles. A leash of thin black whips. Well, both the word leash and whips, I would argue, are also in the semantic field of of pain, of suffering, of torture maybe. If we think of whips, we're thinking of punishment, aren't we? And leash is a similar thing. It's like a thin strip of leather often, or a material. A leash of thin black whips. So we've got the sort of frightening connotations. And if you want to use that word connotations, it's a useful one to have. It just means the associations you have with a certain word. So connotation. Goodness me, I'm getting messages all over the place here. Sorry about that. Connotations of fear and connotations of pain and torture. And then it goes straight into the zoomorphic description, like the arms of an octopus. So there we've got a simile. The vehicle being the tentacles, the tenor being the tentacles, the vehicle being the octopus. So it's been compared to an octopus. Again, we're back to things like the kraken, the sea creatures, the frightening, not unnatural, but sort of unsettling creatures which pose a threat. And notice how they move. They flash across the sunset. Back to those dynamic verbs like we had before with leapt and jerking. Here's this flashes across the sunset. It's sudden, it's unpredictable, very, very frightening.
Most of the spectators had gathered in one or two groups. One little crowd towards Woking, the other a knot of people in the direction of Chobham.
Oh, that reminds me, I meant to mention at the end of that previous paragraph, what could be going on there, he asks. Who is he asking? He's almost asking the reader. He's directly addressing the reader. And that's quite a frightening, shocking tactic to use, because we feel like we're being asked and we don't know the answers, of course. So it feels even more frightening, unsettling, full of panic, because even the narrator is asking anybody, even the reader, to give him an answer. So it's sort of, that direct address technique is quite a powerful one there too.
Evidently they shared my mental conflict. There were few near me. One man approached. He was, I perceived, a neighbour of mine, though I did not know his name, and accosted. But it was scarcely a time for articulate conversation. "What ugly brutes!" he said. "Good God! What ugly brutes!" He repeated this over and over again.
So this is the technique of having direct speech to describe the Martians. We get this man saying, "What ugly brutes," repeating it, "Good God, what ugly brutes." Now this is far more effective than describing the Martians to us directly, because then we would be faced with the judgment. We would have to sort of, once he's shown us what the Martians look like, there's nowhere to go from that. So it's better to have somebody else, these eyewitnesses, give us their opinions, than to let us have our own opinions sometimes. So we have this person here. The repetition of ugly brutes there is an important structural point. By repeating it, that suggests how ugly these things are. By saying "good God," particularly at the late 1800s, that was quite a strong phrase to use. We wouldn't think twice now about using it, although we probably would in school actually. But back in the 1890s, that would have been quite blasphemous to say that. So that's where context comes in a little bit as well, because we've got to write about when this was written and how things were different then. So to say "good God, what ugly brutes," that's a strong statement to make. That means that this man is finding them frightening and ugly looking, and therefore we would do too. So he's using direct speech there, and strong, almost blasphemous direct speech, to create a stronger sense of how these things look really hideous. And it's more effective than if he just described them to us himself, which he did in the previous chapter, if you remember. But this is sort of more effective because it's a bit like, on TV shows when they use canned laughter, and after a joke they sort of play this recorded laughter and clapping and things. It makes us sort of laugh as well. It kind of encourages us to think the same as them. And that's why TV producers do it. That's what he's doing here in a way. By having other people think that they're frightening, it makes us feel that we too agree.
"Did you see a man in the pit?" I said. But he made no answer to that. We became silent, and stood watching for a time side by side, deriving, I fancy, a certain comfort in one another's company. Then I shifted my position to a little knoll that gave me the advantage of a yard or more of elevation, and when I looked for him, presently, he was walking towards Woking. The sunset faded to twilight before anything further happened. The crowd far away on the left towards Woking seemed to grow, and I heard now a faint murmur from it. The little knot of people towards Chobham dispersed. There was scarcely an intimation of movement from the pit.
Okay, so here we have a bit of pathetic fallacy, which is when the sunset faded to twilight. It's getting darker now, so the natural setting of the story is going from sunset to twilight. Now, of course, like in every horror film you've ever seen, or scary story or TV show, the bad things happen at night time. That's when it's dark, that's when we can't see very well, and we can't see what the danger is. So the fact that it's getting darker here is an important setting point, and that counts as structure. And it's pathetic fallacy, which is spelled pathetic, P-A-T-H-E-T-I-C, and then fallacy, which is another word, F-A-L-L-A-C-Y. In fact, we met this last year in Frankenstein, didn't we, pathetic fallacy, when the thunderstorms sort of suggest the chaos of what's happening in the story. This is a very subtle example of that, but it is there. The fact that it's darker means it's more frightening. Also, in this paragraph, we've got the crowd is growing, seem to grow. We've got incrementum there. The crowd itself are getting bigger. That means that when the heat ray does set loose and destroy them, there are more people to be destroyed. So the incrementum there is building that tension, and of course it allows for more devastation and tragedy when it does actually destroy these people.
It was this, as much as anything, that gave people courage. And I suppose the new arrivals from Woking also helped to restore confidence. At any rate, as the dusk came on, a slow, intermittent movement upon the sandpits began. A movement that seemed to gather force, as the stillness of the evening about the cylinder remained unbroken. Vertical black figures, in twos and threes, would advance, stop, watch, and advance again, spreading out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent that promised to enclose the pit in its attenuated horns. I too, on my side, began to move towards the pit.
Here we've got what's called rising action. In any narrative you have rising action before a climax, and here we've got this rising action. The people are getting closer to the pit, there's more tension, there's more fear. We know that they're sort of being very cautious, but they're still moving gradually towards the pit, and therefore we'll get to see what's inside the pit if we move with him, because he too is drawn to move closer towards the pit. So we've got rising action, which is what the narrative is, a structural technique used by writers to build suspense and build tension.
Then I saw some cabmen, and others had walked boldly into the sandpits, and heard the clatter of hooves and the gride of wheels. I saw a lad trundling off the barrows of apples, and then within 30 yards of the pit, advancing from the direction of Horsell, I noted a little black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. This was the deputation. There had been a hasty consultation, and since the Martians were evidently, in spite of their repulsive forms, intelligent creatures, it had been resolved to show them, by approaching them with signals, that we too were intelligent. Flutter, flutter went the flag, first to the right and then to the left. It was too far for me to recognize anyone there, but afterwards I learnt that Ogilvy, Stent, and Henderson were with others in this attempt at communication. This little group had in its advance dragged inward, so to speak, the circumference of the now almost complete circle of people, and a number of dim black figures followed it at discreet distances. Suddenly there was a flash of light, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs, which drove up, one after the other, straight into the still air. This smoke, or flame, perhaps, would be a better word for it, was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown common towards Chertsey, set with black pine trees, seemed to darken abruptly as these puffs arose, and remain the darker after their dispersal. At the same time, a faint hissing sound became audible.
So this deputation then, meaning a group of people representing other people. So a small group of humans representing all of humanity, going with a white flag to show they mean no harm, to show that they want to communicate with the Martians. Now that is a microcosm, so that the deputation, by the nature of any deputation, is when a number of people represent. So if you think of like house captains, for example, they are together a deputation representing the whole student body, if you like. And here this deputation, made up of Ogilvy, Stent and Henderson, were with them and attempted to communicate to the Martians. They are a microcosm, they're a small version of humanity. So therefore, what happens to them is also a microcosm of what happens to society, because what does happen to them is that suddenly there's a flash of light and greenish smoke comes up out of the pit, and they're basically evaporated. They're just sort of vaporized, these people. And let's bear in mind, these are kind of experts in their field. We've got Stent, who's the astronomer royal. We've got Henderson, who's the journalist. We've got Ogilvy, who's another astronomer. So these are people, these are important characters, and they're just wiped out. We're only on page 25, and some of our main characters have been killed instantly. So, and also while we're just at that point there, the word suddenly, the adverb suddenly, there was a flash of light. Suddenly and flash are both very quick words, and of course it shows the unpredictability and the violent attack that these Martians are capable of as well. So it's worth picking up on these key words as well as looking at the overall meaning. Let's just have a look here before we move on. Yeah, so we're not told at this point that they've been killed, but we can guess that the flash of flame and the hissing sound suggests that they've been burned. And interestingly, it uses tense. If we go back up to the flutter flutter part of the paragraph, a couple of lines down, it says, afterwards I learned that Ogilvy, Stent and Henderson were with the others in this attempt. So afterwards I learned this. Not at the time, but afterwards he learns of this. So that's already foreshadowing that he learns later that these poor people died. But he didn't realise it at the time, of course, but he learns it after. So he's reminding us this has been told from a future perspective, looking back. So this has already happened. This is inevitable. And that increases the fear as well. Very subtle techniques, very subtle structural techniques, but they're very powerful.
Beyond the pit stood the little wedge of people, with the white flag at its apex. Arrested by these phenomena, a little knot of small, vertical black shapes upon the black ground. As the green smoke rose, their faces flashed out pallid green, and faded again as it vanished. Then slowly the hissing passed into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Slowly a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it.
So I've jumped ahead a little bit there with my memory there of the story. It's actually the next paragraph, isn't it, where they attack them. But it's the same effect, really. The last sentence of this paragraph we're on now, the ghost of a beam of light. Interesting that he uses that word ghost, that noun ghost, which is in the semantic field of death anyway, isn't it? And so it's again foreshadowing what happens to these people, that they are destroyed by this laser beam, this heat ray that is sort of flashed upon them, as we saw in the film versions that we've looked at.
Forthwith flashes of actual flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame. It was as if each man was suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Then, by the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run.
So staggering and falling there being an example of hendiadys, both words meaning the same thing really, but used together for emphasis to suggest how chaotic and awful this scene is as they're floundering around in fire, on fire, being destroyed by the Martians in a really horrific way.
I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that little distant crowd. All I felt was that it was something very strange. An almost noiseless and blinding flash of light, and a man fell headlong and lay still. And as the unseen shaft passed over them, pine trees burst into fire, and every dry furze bush became with one dull thud a mass of flames. And far away, towards Knapp Hill, I saw the flashes of trees and hedges and wooden buildings suddenly set alight.
So here we've got a few things. We've got these verbs, well, nouns as well, actually. A flash of light, burst into fire, a mass of flames in that paragraph there. The word flash and the word burst, and then flashes of trees again towards the end of that paragraph. They're very sudden, quick words which suggest the violence and unpredictability of this attack from the Martians. So that's one thing we can say. That's the language point. And then you've got the proper noun of Knapp Hill. Again, he's setting this in a very recognisable place. I know we might not know where Knapp Hill is necessarily, but many of his readers, Londoners, would know where Knapp Hill was. Many of the wealthy commuters, as we've said, who lived in Surrey would know Knapp Hill, would have lived in Knapp Hill as they commuted into the city to make their fortunes. And so he's using a small suburban place, but it's a very affluent, wealthy place to live. And by using proper nouns, he makes it all the more realistic. He could have set it, anywhere with made-up names, like what would he have said in Harry Potter? Little whinging, is it? To avoid that. But actually, he wants to make it realistic. He wants to make this seem very real, and so he uses real place names, proper nouns of places in Surrey. That's another point you could make. That's a language point too. A structural point is in the last sentence, just after the word Knapp Hill. I saw the flashes of trees and hedges and wooden buildings suddenly set alight. So we have a list there of things that have been burned, and it's a polysyndetic list because it's and. It's repeating the and connective. So it's poly, so POLYSYNDETIC. I apologise if I'm repeating this, and I've said it before. I'm recording things for college as well with another book, and I forget which ones I've said which. So I'll keep saying the same again just to remind you, and it's probably helpful to spell it out anyway. So that's a polysyndetic list because it repeats the word and. So trees and hedges and wooden buildings. Normally you'd expect commas and only get the and at the end, but in this case he's using polysyndeton there, which is what the technique's called, which is on at the end rather than IC. So polysyndeton as a technique, and he's using that probably to reinforce just how much destruction is taking place. It's trees and hedges and wooden buildings. It makes it sound more. And notice also it's a triadic structure. There are three things there. Nearly always things in groups of three, which if it was just two things, it wouldn't sound as much. But three suggests it's a wide-ranging scene of devastation.
It was sweeping round swiftly and steadily, this flaming death.
So I'll just stop it there because flaming death is obviously a crucial one. It's a metaphor. It's personifying death. This flaming death is sweeping round. So it's personifying the actual attack. But not only that, it's personifying death itself. This flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I'll just carry on a little bit there, even though I've not got there in the book. But this sword of heat is also a metaphor. And notice that the words there, the word sword, the word death, they're both taken from the semantic field of conflict and battle and ultimately death. So we've got these two words here used in close conjunction to create an overall effect. So we've got two things happening here, language and structure. We've got the language of the metaphor, the personification of death, the metaphor of sword, and the semantic field of conflict and death. But the fact they're juxtaposed together so closely for an effect is a structural point. So you can see here that language and structure are best used when they work together in unison, in tandem, and that's what we've got here. So you've got, in the exam, you'll want to be looking all the time for language points to make, structural points to make as well. Language points are easier. Everyone makes language points, but not everyone makes structural points because they're less obvious, and they're also probably not as well covered, really. So I want to make sure you've got plenty of structural points to make, equal to the language points, really, so that you can make a really balanced answer in your exam and really wow the examiner, because they won't see as many structural points. So if you can make good structural points, you'll be in with a real advantage.
This invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I perceived it coming towards me by the flashing bushes it touched, and was too astounded and stupefied to stir. I heard the crackle of fire in the sandpits, and the sudden squeal of a horse that was suddenly stilled. Then it was as if an invisible yet intensely heated finger were drawn through the heather between me and the Martians, and all along a curving line beyond the sandpits, the dark ground smoked and crackled.
More hendiadys there for effect of smoked and crackled. Essentially the same cause. It's the fire, it's the heat that's made both those things happen, but by putting them together using hendiadys, we get this increased impact. So you'll see these patterns start to emerge, and you'll start to get an eye for these things. That H.G. Wells has a very, what's called an idiosyncratic style. He has a very familiar style that once you've spotted it, you can see it anywhere. And always look out for those groups of two words together for impact. He uses hendiadys an awful lot, more than any writer I can think of, actually. But once you know that, it makes it very easy to spot them, and therefore to pick up on them in the exam if you get an extract with them in, which is highly likely, because nearly all of his writing, most pages include hendiadys at some point.
Something fell with a crash far away to the left, where the road from Woking station opens up onto the common. Forthwith the hissing and humming ceased, and the black, dome-like object sank slowly out of sight, into the pit. All this had happened with such swiftness that I had stood motionless, dumbfounded, and dazzled by the flashes of light. Had that death swept through a full circle, it must inevitably have slain me in my surprise. But it passed, and spared me, and left the night about me suddenly dark and unfamiliar.
And there we have some more look at the end of the paragraph. It's nearly always at the end of sentences and paragraphs that you find he uses this technique, so do look out for those particularly. This is another reason why I think this is a good choice for the exam, because it's such an, as I say, idiosyncratic book in that it has a very clear style that it uses, and that makes it very easy to spot the techniques. It's also, well, as we said before, it's very closely related to its context, and it's a very simple book in many respects, a very simple story. There aren't many characters to get confused about. The storyline, the plot is very straightforward, so it lends itself very well to revising and writing in an exam. So we've got dark and unfamiliar of hendiadys there. It's unfamiliar because it's dark, isn't it? So those two words again used as hendiadys there, and I'll just spell it again for reference: Hendiadys. And oh no, that doesn't sound right. Hang on, Diadys. Yeah, that is right. And for effect, because of course he feels very vulnerable. He was almost killed by the heat ray, but luckily he was spared. Well, that's no coincidence, is it? Of course, if he had been killed, it'd be a very short book. So he has to survive because he's the one narrating the story. We know he survives because he's writing this 4 years on after the event, as he's told us in the first part of the book. So we know he makes it through this, and because he has to, he's the one that narrates the story to us.
The undulating common seemed now dark, almost to blackness, except where its roadways lay grey and pale, under the deep blue sky of the early night. It was dark, and suddenly void of men. Overhead the stars were mustering, and in the west the sky was still a pale, bright, almost greenish blue. The tops of the pine trees and the roofs of Horsell came out sharp and black against the western afterglow. The Martians and their appliances were altogether invisible, save for that thin mast upon which their restless mirror wobbled. Patches of bush and isolated trees here and there smoked and glowed still, and the houses towards Woking station were sending up spires of flame into the stillness of the evening air.
He's just reminding us here about the tranquility of the actual place, the leafy, calm suburb of Woking. This is a beautiful part of the country, and it's been destroyed. So he's reminding us of just where they are. He mentions that word Woking Station. Again, he's using that word Horsell, these proper nouns of the place, just to remind the reader of where this is taking place and how nature has been destroyed here by the Martians and the stillness of the evening air. So it's a very sinister and quite disturbing image of this chaos, but then once the chaos is finished, it's this sort of silence and this feeling of loneliness that the narrator experiences.
Nothing was changed, save for that and a terrible astonishment. The little group of black specks with the flag of white had been swept out of existence, and the stillness of the evening, so it seemed to me, had scarcely been broken. It came to me that I was upon this dark common, helpless, unprotected, and alone.
I'm sure you'll have spotted that yourself, but the triadic structure there of his feelings, helpless, unprotected, and alone. So you've got that asyndetic list in a triadic structure, helpless, unprotected, and alone. And that was the point I was making, that he feels very lonely. And I think the point that he makes in the previous paragraph is actually one I was trying to say before, that it's the fact that this chaos has happened. These people have been swept out of existence and destroyed instantaneously, and yet it's actually still quite a tranquil, still evening. It's not like a usual battle where there's noise and there's chaos for many, many minutes or hours or days or whatever. This is just an instantaneous sort of flash of attack, and then it's all back to quiet again. So it's a very efficient way of attacking people, and that therefore makes it more disturbing and more frightening, I think, because of its efficiency and its sort of clinical precision rather than any sort of lingering battle.
Suddenly, like a thing falling upon me from without, came fear.
So a bit of figurative language there. Like a thing falling upon me. So he's comparing it to something, again, another thing falling upon him. So fear has sort of attacked him. Fear has fallen onto him suddenly. And so there's that simile being used there. And it's quite a powerful image. And it's almost, well, it's personifying fear as well, isn't it? Fear itself is falling on it. Fear is sort of attacking him. So you've got personification within that simile. They're both language points that you could make about that bit.
With an effort, I turned and began a stumbling run through the heather. The fear was no rational fear, but a panic terror, not only of the Martians, but of the dusk and stillness all about me. Such an extraordinary effect in unmanning me it had that I ran weeping silently as a child might do. Once I turned, I did not dare look back. I remember I felt an extraordinary persuasion that I was being played with, that presently, when I was upon the very verge of safety, this mysterious death, as swift as the passage of light, would leap after me from the pit about the cylinder and strike me down.
So notice there then, even at the end, we've got this personification of death. This mysterious death would leap after me from the pit about the cylinder and strike me down. So again, there's a parenthetic clause there, with the as swift as the passage of light, which you can almost remove that, which we'll come back to in a second. But it's the death itself that might leap after him. So it's personifying death again. That's another language point you could make about this extract. And then just looking at that parenthetic clause there, as swift as the passage of light, that's another simile, isn't it? So another use of figurative language there, a simile, as swift as the passage of light, as fast as the speed of light. So we're sort of verging on scientific lexis there as well, there, because this was, of course, at a time when scientists did know, or were beginning to, I'm trying to think when Einstein was, but beginning to sort of understand the speed of light and the concept of light as a concept and something which can be measured in terms of its speed. So again, he's drawing on that, sort of leaning on scientific lexis, which is another language point, but the effect of that's far more powerful. The effect is that it actually makes this far more realistic. He's leaning on something which we know to be true and to be rational minded. This isn't some fancy, dreamy romance novel. This is something based on scientific fact, and therefore that's more frightening. Okay, and that's it for chapter 5. The next one's really short. Chapter 6 is a tiny chapter, so I'll see you back again for that one. Bye for now.